Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we are in round 2 of our coverage of the 2016 World Chess Championship between Magnus Carlsen, the reigning champion, and the challenger Sergei Karjakin. In game 1, we did have a draw. Magnus Carlsen did have the white pieces trying out the d4 Trompowsky opening with bishop to g5. Didn't go as I think he planned. Pretty drawish game throughout. No one even really tried to do much, in my opinion. Game 2, we have Sergei Karjakin playing the white pieces, trying to get out in front of his opponent. We have a 12-game match going on over the next few weeks, so anytime you can get a victory, especially with the white pieces, it is very, very important. So Sergei starts out with pawn to e4. This is kind of what we expected from Carlsen yesterday. Pawn to e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, getting into the Ruy Lopez, and then pawn to a6. And this is somewhat odd from Magnus Carlsen. He pretty much always plays knight to f6. In fact, most of the top players are playing this Berlin defense a lot more, but Magnus Carlsen, even going back to the World Championships against Vishy Anand, he really favors that knight to f6 Berlin defense. So kind of odd to see him play more of a classical Morphy defense with the pawn to a6. After bishop to a4, plays knight to f6, and then castle on the king side. And from here, Magnus Carlsen has a lot of different options. He could go with more of an open defense with knight taking on e4. He could always play more of a Russian defense, which I think would be somewhat fitting considering his opponent's Russian. Pawn to d6. Could always play more of an Archangel defense with pawn to b5. But he opts for just kind of the closed defense. And that's bishop to e7. Says, I'm not going to do too much. I'm going to continue my development, castle on the king side, and then continue from there. And then pawn to d3. And this is really the first time that we've seen a move that's kind of outside the ordinary. For white, it has lots of different options here. You could have kind of a delayed exchange here on c6. Knight to c3 is what I usually end up playing this particular spot. Or if you want to just play a little bit more aggressive, pawn to d4, just trying to blow up the center of the board here as white, since you do have a small tempo advantage. But decided to play pawn to d3, just solidify the pawn shape. It's not super aggressive though. But if you kind of look back, Sergei actually played this just a few months ago in the Chess Olympiad, so he's familiar with this opening, this particular variation. Although we don't see it too often, it does come up in his repertoire. So continues with pawn to b5 for Magnus Carlsen, bishop back here b3. Pawn to d6, just solidifying this pawn chain. Also opening up the door for the light square bishop to get involved as needed. Pawn to a3. Castle on the king side, knight to c3, both sides just continuing the development. Knight to a5, attacking the bishop, and then the bishop coming back here to a2. This is kind of something Bobby Fischer used to do a lot. Bring his bishop over here to c4, and then eventually bring it back here to a2. Slightly different variation getting into the Ruy Lopez, but same kind of concept, bringing the bishop back here to a2. Still attacking this long diagonal with the pawns here on e5 and d6. It allows this light square bishop to be very, very important in the attack. Magnus Carlsen's not really having that, so he plays bishop here to e6, just trying to stop that attack right now. Says, let's go ahead and exchange on board if you want to. Decides not to, instead plays pawn to d4, and I like that. I don't really like playing bishop takes on e6, because then the pawn recaptures. Yes, black has double pawns here. Anytime you have double pawns in the center of the board, it's not as bad, especially if you have kind of support here from your d-pawn as well. And then you open up a semi-open file on the f-file for this rook to really get involved and really start to attack your opponent's king side. So all in all, I don't recommend playing, just bishop takes here on e6, but it does look like this light square bishop is going to have to fall for Sergei Karjakin. So pawn to d4, trying to strike the center of the board, and then we do see an exchange on board with the bishops, and then the rook ticking here on a2. Magnus Carlsen, rook over to e8, just getting his rook a little more centralized into the game. Rook back here to a1. It's not doing anything here on a2, so it just brings it back to a1. Knight to c4, just kind of a transitional move. It's not really attacking too much right now. Sergei has the opportunity just to play pawn to b3. This is probably what I would do on board. I think it's easy just to go ahead and kick your opponent back right here. Knight back, b6. You can play bishop to e3 if you want to. Or if you're worried about this, knight to g4, that's going to just kick your bishop back here to d2. You can always play pawn to h3 here. You can play rook here to e1 as a first move, but I would just go ahead and play that that pawn to b3. We end up seeing this a little bit later, but decides to go and play rook to e1 first. Rook to c8, just centralizing a little bit more. Pawn to h3, and then Magnus Carlsen waited for a little bit and then played pawn to h6. So both sides just trying to block off some of these critical squares over here. g4 square from white, so the knight can't get involved into the action. And this pawn here on h6 blocking off the square here on g5, so the knight can't get into the action. So both these knights really just now protecting and controlling the center of the board. Pawn to b3, kicking the knight back here to b6, and then bishop to b2. So did have the option of getting involved, but decided since this pawn here on h6, it's not going to be doing too much. Pawn e3, not as exciting, knowing that it's not going to be coming here to f4 or g5 anytime soon. So it says, I'm going to go ahead and start gearing up for the center of the board. If we do see some exchange on these dark squares, wants to go ahead and have his dark square bishop involved into that action. Bishop back here to f8. Magnus Carlsen's kind of thinking about the same thing, so wants to make sure his rook is involved. Rook here to e8. Rook on e8, protecting this dark square bishop right here, or dark square here on e5. After the exchange, we see pawn to a4. And a lot of people in this particular situation thought that Sergey should go ahead and just take with his queen. So queen takes on d8. I think it's worth a look how this particular variation would end up. Not exactly sure, but rook take from c8 to d8. Wants to make sure he doesn't take with this rook, because then you can just go ahead and take that pawn right here on e5. But after this rook takes, all of a sudden knight to a2, opening up the door for this dark square bishop here on b2 to attack this pawn. Does have the other knight here, so maybe knight over here to d7, protecting, but does kind of block this rook off from the action, and then a rook over here to d1, getting into this open file to try to control that as much as possible. It's kind of tough. You have this knight over here on a2. That's not going to be involved into the action anytime soon. And it's not clear that you have a super strong attack. Even this bishop right here is still kind of tied down to this pawn on a3. So at the end of the day, Sergey kind of looked at this and said, I'm going to go a different route. I see an advantage here with pawn to a4, so continues with pawn to a4. Pawn to c6, just solidifying this pawn chain a little bit, and also controlling the square here on d5. Still a very important square in the center of the board. And then we start to see an exchange on board. So Sergey says, okay, let's go ahead and exchange off queens, and then pawn takes on b5. Pawn recaptures, knight to e2, bishop down here to b4. And Magnus Carlsen had a few options here. I think as soon as I see knight down here on e2, this does kind of block this rook here on e1 from protecting this pawn on e4. I would just immediately take here on e4. I recognize that the bishop could take here on e5. That does kind of blow up the central pawns, but then knight down here to d2. This just starts to put a lot of pressure on my opponent. You now have a very active rook controlling this knight right here. We're really not going to see take right here, because then all of a sudden Magnus Carlsen's attacking the second rank. That's not what you want your opponent to be doing. But at the end of the day, Magnus Carlsen really liked to go ahead and get his dark square bishop involved a little bit sooner. So bishop here to b4. Bishop here to c3. Magnus Carlsen decides, let's go ahead and exchange those off on board. Knight takes on c3. Knight over here to d7, protecting this pawn here on e5. And then rook up here to a6, rook here to c8. So Magnus Carlsen is definitely in a defense mode, not really trying to attack any of Sergey's pieces at all. Pawn up here to b4, rook down here e6, more defensive, trying to eye down, make sure nothing happens with these pawns on board. Rook over here, b1, pawn here to c5, opening up the door, says, hey, if you want to go ahead and exchange on board, that's fine with me. I'll take here. Now, keep in mind, Magnus Carlsen does have double pawns here, although it is going to be somewhat difficult to go ahead and take advantage of this if you are Sergey Karjakin. Knight takes on b5, pawn recaptures on b4. After the rook takes, rook down here to c2, getting on the second rank. Knight up here at d6, and then rook down here c1, and this is kind of the end of the game. King up here h2, rook to c2, attacking the pawn here on f2, kind of forcing the king to come back here to g1 to protect this. And in this particular spot, they did decide to draw the game. I actually think they may have drawn the game a little bit earlier, but they do need to get to 30 moves in this tournament. And so after 33 moves, they decided to go ahead and draw the game. Afterwards, they even kind of asked some of the players that it wasn't the most exciting. No one really went for anything too crazy. as we talked about in the first game, they've had months and months of preparation, especially that first game. I think it's so important to just psychologically get a big win under your belt. I thought we would just see some haymakers out there, some lines and some openings we've never even really seen played at a high level in a long time. All in all, these players have come out of the gate and haven't played anything crazy at all. And Magnus Carlsen kind of responded to those questions and said, hey, every game is not going to be fireworks. We do have 12 games that we're going to be playing, so be patient. Games definitely will be exciting, but this one, not the most exciting. And I think any chess fan, even the players themselves, recognize that not much was going on. Still very, very high-level chess. You just don't see this variation in the Rai Lopez very often. I think both players played extremely well. They didn't get out of line. They didn't do anything too crazy. So all in all, we're tied up. Both players have a full point, getting half a point in each of the games for a tie. So we will take a day off in the next day, and then we will come back on Monday for Game 3, and Magnus Carlsen will have the white pieces. So everyone, thanks for watching, following along with the coverage over the next few weeks. Enjoy the video, and I will see y'all in the next one. Thanks again for watching.